Everyone believed the billionaire's son had been born completely blind. For years, no one questioned it. Not the doctors, not the staff, not even his father. The boy grew up in silence, cut off from the world, hidden away in a mansion full of secrets, until the day a new maid appeared. She wasn't a doctor, not a specialist, just someone who paid attention. If you believe that a single spark of attention can light up an entire life, hit like subscribe to the channel right now and drop a comment with where you're watching from. I want to know where you are on this map of stories. The Wakefield mansion sat tucked between rows of maples, its glass facade a cold mirror reflecting the pale sky. Inside was dark wood, thick carpets, leather chairs without a single crease, everything elegant yet lifeless. The clocks carved each day into rigid squares: 7:30 breakfast, 9 sensory therapy, 2 quiet hour, 8:30 story time. But within those precise boxes lay a heavy emptiness. Eli Wakefield, age 7, eyes open but unfocused, sat in the same chair by the window every day, copying the day before. His father, Richard Wakefield, 42, was an agriculture magnate, land storage supply chains, a reputation so strong his handshake could ripple through boardrooms. But at home, especially after sunset, Richard was just a silver-streaked man with hollow eyes, moving slowly, as if dragging an invisible weight. The year Eli was born was the year his wife died in a helicopter crash. The nursery remained untouched: soft-colored walls, animal decals, a rocking chair by the crib. Richard never changed a thing, as if moving even one detail would betray her memory. Eli barely spoke. When Richard read aloud, the boy tilted his head ever so slightly. When music played, sometimes his eyebrows twitched. Movements so small most people would miss them, but to Richard they were the last thin thread between father and son, just enough to keep him holding on but not enough to stop him from wearing out. Specialists came and went: therapists, sensory experts, early intervention teachers, piles of reports. Yet Eli remained unchanged, silence, fortified like a wall. The household staff was small and discreet. Mrs. Harper, the strict housekeeper, Tom Briggs, gardener, and handyman Ella, the quick, cheerful cook. They respected Richard's distance, partly an order, partly habit. With Eli, they followed the mantra of safety: walk softly, speak gently, never try anything new unless the doctor ordered it. Each morning, someone carried a tiny vial of eye drops into Eli's room, administered the exact dose, then checked the calendar. No one really knew what it was for. They trusted it because the label carried the name of the family doctor since Eli's birth, Dr. Atticus Morrow. The day Julia Bennett came to interview Richard himself opened the door. Julia, 27. Black shoulders, straight eyes calm, wearing a pressed dark shirt. She didn't smile much, didn't talk much, didn't try to fit the vibe of the mansion. She simply showed up fully present. Her resume was simple experience in apartments, hotels, references just enough. Yet Richard, who had dismissed several perfect candidates, paused longer with her. "I just lost my child," Julia said softly. Richard asked nothing more. Grief recognized grief. He nodded. A quick tour, the Lakeview living room hallways hung with abstract art, spotless glass cabinets. Mrs. Harper froze for half a beat when Richard said, "Julia will be on trial for 1 month." Harper's glance wasn't harsh but clear. Why her in rarefied spaces, prejudice walks barefoot. Barely a sound, but heavy with weight. Julia didn't flinch, didn't justify herself. She listened to routines, memorized with her eyes, careful not to break the house's rhythm of silence. During her first break, Julia stood at the kitchen doorway and saw Eli in his usual spot, the wide window. He clutched a worn teddy bear. His face was so still he looked like stone. Julia didn't approach. She sat in a chair a few yards away, opened her lunchbox and let her breath fall into sync with the house's quiet. Autumn wind slipped through the doorframe. The curtain stirred. Eli's head tilted ever so slightly toward the light. A movement as small as a scratch on glass, but to a mother who had just passed through grief, the question sparked in Julia. Did he sense the light? That night, after cleaning up, Richard stood in the hallway. "Your first day, how was it?" Julia answered simply, "Silent, but silence has rhythm." She didn't promise, didn't present a grand plan. She asked for time. "I'm not here to replace anyone. I just want to be here in the least disruptive way." Richard was quiet for a long time. He was relearning how to place trust without turning it into a burden. Night fell, and the mansion returned to its cold rails. But one rail had shifted just 0.5 millimeter. Starting tomorrow, another pair of watchful eyes would walk the halls, counting light shadow breeze, noticing micro-movements without expecting miracles. From that small shift, the story began. In those first days, Julia blended into the background as if she had always been there. She learned the sounds of the house mop wheels gliding over wood, no squeaks, broom bristles, brushing the baseboards. Don't scrape curtains pulled at a 45° angle, never all at once. Here, mistakes weren't about stains, but about volume and suddenness. Julia built an invisible notebook in her mind. Sudden noise. Eli's face tightens. Gradual light increase. Eli tilts his head. She soon realized an unnamed culture had grown around. Eli Don't Disturb had been rebranded as safety. Everyone stepped back, reducing stimulation to nearly zero. But zero also meant no data, no way to know what Eli could respond to. Motherhood and losing her child had taught Julia that small signals need stability and controlled variables. Not make noise, not flood with stimuli, but change one factor at a time to see where Eli's boundaries lay. Julia called it the one-variable method. On the third day at noon, Julia sat folding sheets outside Eli's room. She heard a faint hum, not yet a melody, more like someone testing sounds. Julia didn't rush in with good singing, didn't press for conversation. She slid her chair slightly closer to the doorway, enough to be present without intruding. Moments later, Eli shuffled toward the door, his hand hovering as if feeling the shape of the air. Julia extended her hand halfway between them, not grabbing, not pulling, just there. His small hand touched her fingertip, then paused. 5 seconds. 10. Then he pulled back as if confirming something vital, there was someone here, and that someone didn't hurt. At that moment, Mrs. Harper passed by, setting down a tray of glasses a little too firmly. A glance, half reminder, half doubt. Julia gave a small smile, no defense. Subtle collisions like that filled the days, no insults, but hierarchy quietly enforced through wordless gestures. Julia didn't argue with words. She answered with the quality of her presence. On the 4th day, Julia tried light shadow for the first time without equipment. She drew the curtain 1/3 open, letting brightness rise just enough without the metallic scrape. Eli stopped humming his head, turning slightly toward the patch of light on the wall. Julia stood still, counting breaths to measure the reaction's length. She didn't rush to label it seeing. That word was too heavy, too likely to shatter a father's fragile hope. She called it responding to changes in light, humble enough to leave room for proof. Later that afternoon, while dusting the bookshelves, her cloth slipped to the carpet. The sound was tiny. Eli's brow twitched like a ripple. Julia whispered a soft apology, not for politeness, but to place responsibility within their shared space. Whoever caused the sound should own it. A moment later, Eli hummed again, higher pitched, shorter. 2 senses now, light and sound, both drew responses. Julia began writing for real, no longer just the invisible notebook, 0915, curtain, 13 open east-facing room. Eli tilted 3-fighter toward lit patch on left wall estimate. 12:10. Hallway, humming continued. 20:30 stopped when heavy footsteps passed. 15:40. Cloth dropped softly, right brow twitch once. The data wasn't clean, but what Julia needed was repetition. If responses repeated, it meant beneath the silence there was structure. Then she noticed the ritual of the eye drops. 7:45. Ella placed the vial on the tray. 8:08. Harper carried it in. 18:05. Faint click of the cap. 18:06. A mark on the wall calendar. Julia didn't interfere, but she added one more line to her notebook. After 18:05, reduced response to light shadow. She didn't conclude cause and effect. She simply underlined that entry day after day. On Thursday evening, Richard stood in the hallway watching Julia tidy up, while also observing Eli at the far end. His words came like a sigh. "It's been so long. I don't know what to rely on anymore." Julia answered, "We can rely on what repeats." Then she explained her method change. One factor at a time. Repeat enough to rule out chance. Record, honestly, whether the outcome looks good or bad. Richard was silent for a long while. He had heard 100 technical terms. Tonight, he heard the language of methodical care. Steady, ordinary, and testable within his own house. At the level of race and class, invisible collisions continued. The gate guard asked Julia's name more carefully than the florist's. Maintenance staff over-explained the elevator as if she couldn't understand. Julia translated every irritation into fuel for her central work, staying beside Eli without pressing down, because even pressing with a question, an expectation, a demand for faster progress could make silence shrink back like a pond struck by stones. On Friday night, Julia sat on the window ledge a few steps from Eli. Thin moonlight, a room half waking, half dreaming. Then it happened. Eli leaned his head against the frame, lifting his face slightly as if listening to the light. Not seeing, but certainly not nothing. Julia didn't cry. Tears blur notes. She closed her notebook with a single line. Light has no sound, but it has rhythm. What lay ahead, flashlights, confrontations, stopping medication tests, courtrooms was still on the horizon, but the path had formed a tension, data, pattern. And at the end of a part 2, the Wakefield mansion warmed by a single degree, simply because a black woman chose to sit still and count the rhythm of light with a little boy. The next morning, Julia woke before the mansion's alarm bell. She moved through the hallway like a shadow woven into the carpet, opened the curtains, 1/3, as she had the day before, then stood still in the edge of the light. Eli was already in his chair by the window, same posture, same worn teddy bear, same face, as flat as a pond without ripples. As the new beam of light slid across the wall, his head tilted ever so slightly. Julia counted silently to 8 before drawing the curtain just a bit so the brightness wouldn't fall away too suddenly. No words were spoken. Only time passed slow, as if a second clock existed just for the two of them. At 8:55, Mrs. Harper's footsteps crossed the hall. At 9:00 sharp, the sensory therapy schedule on the wall gave a little click, reminding everyone of the familiar order. But Julia had her own order. She chose the small empty stretches between fixed hours when the vacuum hadn't started, when the kitchen fan was off, when the lake's breeze was still calm. She changed one factor, then waited. Waited so long that once Ella passed by and thought she had dozed off. At noon, when the house slipped into quiet hour, Julia sat at Eli's doorway, pretending to sort a toy basket. She waved her hand across the sunlight to cast a moving shadow on the floor, from very slow to moderately slow. Eli didn't turn his head, but his eyes twitched once so small she had to look twice to be sure. Julia kept the rhythm. She lowered her hand slower so the shadow cut across her shoes and up toward her knees. Eli's eyelids flickered like a clock hand jumping off mark. She froze for 3 breaths. Then she repeated the shadow's path left to right, right to left, drawing an invisible line in the air. This time, his pupils shifted with the shadow's direction by a margin almost impossible to measure. Julia swallowed, afraid of being too happy too soon. She logged it in the small gray notebook she always kept in her apron pocket. 12:55 hand shadow, plus 101 nana from face eyelid flicker, 1 pupil shift, 1 approx. 12:57, shadow repeated slowly. Response repeated. By 1 Hildaros, Julia shut the notebook and switched to dusting Eli's bathroom shelves. On the top, behind neatly folded towels, she found a wooden box. She pulled it down. Inside were several glass vials of eye drops, their labels old and yellowing. Doctor's name, Atticus Morrow. The print read daily dosage, but no diagnosis. The dates stretched across years. At the bottom, a folded sheet of paper marked renewal corners, browned with age. Julia froze as if someone had touched her shoulder. She didn't read aloud. She counted the bottles, 1, 2, 3, 8, some nearly empty, some nearly full. She placed them back exactly as before, towels flush against the box labels turned inward, but the faint chemical scent clung cold to her fingertips. That afternoon, Eli sat again by the window. Julia checked her phone for the time. The screen lit suddenly. The flash swept across his face for a moment. Eli's eyelids snapped shut quick, as someone squinting at sunlight after a dark room. Julia froze. No footsteps, no crash, no sound to blame. Only light. A second time she held the glow longer, moving the phone slowly across Eli's eye level. His gaze shifted uneven small like a violin string tuned just half a turn tighter. Julia gripped the phone, afraid her trembling would shake the light. A third time, she moved it farther away, angled lower, so the beam grazed his cheek instead of striking directly. No reaction. She wrote, "May need more direct light angle." By nightfall in her small staff room, Julia opened her old laptop. She didn't have a password to Eli's records, no right to search deep files. She simply typed cyclopentylate child long-term light response. Dozens of articles appeared, half understood, half not. Lines repeated, suppresses light, reflex dilates pupil, temporarily not recommended for long-term use in young children. Julia bit her lip, remembering Sophia Carter, her old nursing school friend now an ophthalmology resident in the next city. She typed a short message, "Soph, I need you to look at an eye drop vial. Child, used for years. I've seen light response, though diagnosis says congenital blindness. Can we meet?" The scene mark appeared almost instantly. Sophia replied, "Day after tomorrow, 10 a.m. cafe across from the hospital." "Bring the vial." Julia closed the laptop and leaned back against the wall. Everything was drifting toward an unnamed shore. What if I'm wrong? What if I'm right? Both questions felt equally terrifying. The next morning, the ritual returned. 7:45. Ella placed the tray. 8:00 Harper carried it in. 8:05 faint cap click. 8:06 calendar marked. Julia pretended to fold laundry nearby, eyes down, ears open. At 8:40, she tested the shadow again. No response. At 9:15, she opened the curtain 1/3. No tilt of the head. She noted 40 min after drops, lowered response. She didn't write suppressed. She wasn't yet entitled to say that. That night, before retreating to her room, Julia sat on Eli's doorway step. "Eli," she whispered, like tapping softly on a wall of silence. He didn't answer, just lifted his head for 1 second before leaning back to the frame. Julia extended her hand, not touching just there. 1 beat, 2, 3. His small fingers found hers again at the same spot as before. She squeezed lightly, not pulling, just asking permission. Eli didn't withdraw. On the desk, her phone lit with a new message, its glow sliding over the wood. "See you at 10. Don't touch dosage without doctor. Be careful. Sophia. Julia nodded to herself as if Sophia were standing right there. Okay, she whispered, then slipped the phone into her apron pocket. She had no plan to touch the medication. She only intended to touch the light in the right place at the right time with just one variable. Night deepened. Outside, the lake lay flat like a sheet of dark glass. Inside, the single inhale and exhale of a boy was enough for Julia to know she still stood on the path of something slowly returning. Not a miracle. Just the world if you're willing to watch it long enough. On the 8th night, Julia decided to standardize the experiment. No more accidental light from a phone screen, but a clear source she could repeat. She bought a small flashlight from a convenience store on her way home, white beam moderate power. In her own room, she practiced first in the mirror. Slow approach, lower angle, raise angle, cover, part of the lens with paper so the light wouldn't be too harsh. She jotted a few simple parameters on a sticky note and tucked it inside her apron. When the house fell quiet after 9 p.m., Julia stood at Eli's doorway. He sat cross-legged on the rug back against the bed, teddy bear propped on his stomach face, angled toward the window. The nightlight was set to its lowest dim. Julia took a breath and said softly, "Eli, I'm going to shine a little light. If it bothers you, lift your hand and I'll stop right away." No answer. Julia switched on the flashlight, a thin beam low at first, then raised slowly until it brushed across the corner of Eli's eye. His eyelids flinched once. Julia counted to 3, holding the beam at the edge, never into the pupil. "Eli, can you feel it?" she whispered. He tilted his head slightly toward the light. Julia pulled the beam back to the side and switched it off. Her pulse hammered in her throat. She tried again, this time giving the light a faint sway to create movement. Eli's eyes shifted small, uneven, like someone trying to follow a firefly. Julia wanted to cry, but held steady. Her small science required steady hands. She turned off the light, set it down on the rug, and sat facing him at a safe distance. "Do you want to try again?" she asked, knowing he rarely answered with words. Eli didn't shake his head. He didn't turn away either. Julia read it as yes. She turned the flashlight back on, casting the shadow of her hand into the beam so it swept across his cheek before the light itself reached him. The point to distinguish between a response to light versus shadow. This time, his eyes followed the light, not the shadow. Julia drew the light back, just as a man's voice cut into the room like a snapped wire. "What are you doing with my son?" Richard stood in the doorway, shirt collar, unbuttoned face, flushed, hand gripping the dresser. Before Julia could answer, he stepped in, yanking the flashlight from her hand. "You're experimenting on him." "Here." His shoulders shook. Years of pain, guilt, helplessness all rising through the cracks in his control. Julia stayed still, hands open, palms facing him like she was asking him not to sound the alarm. I only used a very small light, moved slowly to test response. If Eli was uncomfortable, I would. She never finished. Something no one expected happened. Eli sprang up. Not inching, not feeling his way like always, but stood and walked straight toward Julia. He wrapped his arms around her waist, holding tight like someone clinging to shore after a wave. Everything stopped. Brakes slammed. Richard froze. He had never seen his son make a move like this. Choose someone, step forward, embrace. "Eli," he croaked. The boy didn't let go. His chin pressed into Julia's apron, his breath heavy. Then a whisper broke out, clinging to his throat, halting like first speech. "I see light." He lifted his face toward the dark spot where Julia had lowered the beam. Another word fell fragile as glass mommy. The room echoed hollow for a long second. Julia placed her hand on Eli's back, not soothing, Not explaining, not denying, just there. Richard stepped back, flashlight still in hand. He swallowed as if forcing down years at once. When he spoke, his voice had dropped less sharp. Stop the drops. Now. No one argued. The next morning, 7:45 brought no tray. 8:00, Harper carried in no vial. 8:06, the calendar bore no mark. The silence in the house was different now, not avoidance but a held breath waiting for what might come. Day 1, without medication, nothing obvious. Day 2. Julia opened the curtain 1/3. Eli turned his face toward the light and held it there longer. Day 3. Julia brought 3 cards drawn in black marker circle, square triangle. She didn't prompt, didn't say, pick this one, that one. She simply held them up at equal distance. Eli looked for a long time, then pointed to the circle. Julia's mouth fell open, then shut again, afraid words might break what had just arrived. Richard stood in the doorway, stepped halfway in, then stopped. He chose, he said, question or statement unclear. Yes, Julia answered. He chose. That afternoon, Julia set out 3 toys, a soft ball, a toy car, a rubber duck. She gave no hint, only nudged the duck so it squeaked a pinprick sound. Eli smiled. For the first time, a smile with shape, not warped reflex. He pointed at the duck. Richard exhaled audibly, like breaking the surface after too long underwater. That night in the living room, Richard didn't sit across from Eli as usual. He sat beside him, an elbow's space apart. "Do you want to see pictures?" he asked, hand on a dust-covered leather album. Eli didn't answer, but leaned slightly toward the book. Richard opened to the middle, a photo of a woman in a red dress standing in the plum orchard. "Who is she?" His voice broke at the last word. Eli squinted, brows furrowed as if trying to focus. His fingertip landed on the rippling edge of the dress. "Red," he said, the sound brittle but bridging. Richard turned his face away for half a second, and Julia saw the tear caught on his lash. On the 4th day without drops, Eli walked the bright hallway palm, brushing the wall as if reading Braille. No one held him. Julia followed 3 steps behind, not reaching out first. He stopped at the big window, laid his hand on the glass cold, soaking his palm. "Warm," he said, then corrected light. Julia smiled without sound. At the door, Richard leaned against the frame. No orders, no thanks, no good job, just stood there, a marker set back on its road. That evening, the 3 of them sat closer than usual. Julia opened a box of crayons. "Do you want to try colors?" Eli, the boy, picked up a yellow stick unprompted and drew a wavering line across the page. Not straight, not pretty, but real. "Beautiful," Richard said softly, like a promise that needed no witness. Eli drew a second line near the first, then looked out the window. Outside the garden, lamps clicked on warm light spilling across. Inside, a child had just traced his first mark of light on paper. No one spoke of the vials that night. No one spoke of Dr. Morrow or anyone else. They sat in a room where the loudest sound was crayon against paper, and those golden strokes, shapeless still, were enough to change the rhythm of the house's heart. On the 5th morning, after stopping the drops, Julia printed 3 high-contrast boards, white background, thick black shapes. She taped them to the wall opposite the window at Eli's eye level when seated. Early sunlight spilled in tree shadows, rippling like slow waves. Julia counted to 10, then named each shape in a calm, low voice, no coaxing. Circle, square, triangle. Eli lifted his gaze, lingering on the circle a little longer, as if there was less resistance there. "Eli, Julia said if you want to speak, you can touch." He stepped forward slowly and pressed his palm to the circle, tracing its curve as if reading his first letter. Richard stood in the doorway, hands in his pockets, forcing himself not to interfere. He had begun to copy Julia's way patiently, watching what repeated instead of hunting for breakthroughs. At lunch, Julia placed 3 items on the table: a soft ball, a toy car, a rubber duck. She said nothing, only nudged the duck so it squeaked like a tiny laugh. Eli grinned, pointed to the duck, then looked at Julia to make sure she saw what he saw. It was a gaze with direction, with person a shared gaze. In the afternoon, Julia brought out the crayon box. "You choose a color, Eli," she said. He reached in and pulled a yellow unprompted. The crayon wavered across the paper, leaving a trembling streak of brightness. "Beautiful," Richard murmured. Eli drew more lines, each steadier than the last. Julia didn't grade or guide his hand. She only shifted the paper nearer or farther to change the brightness and watched his pupils adjust. Her notes grew longer, her handwriting smaller, as if afraid of making the page too loud. The next day, Julia suggested a tracking game. She tied a thread to a white foam ball and swung it gently before the dark wall. Slow speed, small range. Eli began with his eyes, then followed with a step. Julia moved the ball the other way. He shifted his weight. No rush. Each movement was a small stone laid on a new path. On Saturday afternoon, Richard said, "Tomorrow we get him checked." He had arranged to see a pediatric ophthalmologist unconnected to Morrow. Sunday morning, the car stopped at a small bright clinic. Dr. Patel, salt-and-pepper hair-warm voice, didn't look to Richard first, but crouched to Eli's level. "Hello, Eli." He explained each step in short phrases so the boy would know what was coming. Contrast charts, slit lamp, slow-moving figures, each test was another window. The results weren't a fairy tale. Eli had partial functional vision, sensitive to light-dark contrast and slow motion. His brain could learn to process visual information better if stimulated regularly in a safe environment. Dr. Patel didn't promise normal sight. He drew a clear plan, 30-45 minutes a day of tracking exercises, starting with high-contrast colors, later neutral tones, documenting even the smallest change. Most important, he told Richard, don't rush. The brain learns slowly, but it learns. On the drive back, Eli pointed out the window at the noon sky. "Light," he said, then curled back into his seat. For the first time, the word didn't sound like a whisper trapped in a wall, but like a voice filling a room with an open window. That evening, Julia drafted a light practice schedule. Morning, 10-minute east window curtain, 1-3, 10-min slow shadow tracking, 10-min shape cards. Afternoon, Wenman with yellow and blue objects, opposite colors, 10-min drawing yellow lines on gray background. Evening, 5 to 7-min flashlight spot beam filtered with paper stop if brow tenses too much. Richard signed the corner of the paper as though sealing a new covenant trust built on observation, not miracles. The whole house shifted rhythm. Ella started cooking 10 minutes earlier. Tom delayed trimming to reduce noise. Harper walked softly down the hall during practice time. No one said it, but the gears of a larger machine had turned for one child. That night, Richard reopened the album. Eli wanted to see the page with the red dress. The boy gave a tiny nod. When the page turned, Eli touched the hem of the photographed dress and whispered red. This time, the word was rounder, as if it had finally fallen into its right groove. Richard didn't cry. He exhaled and stayed still. Beside him, Julia didn't clap or say well done. She simply set a yellow crayon near Eli's hand, and he drew another golden streak on fresh paper. The next Monday morning, Eli walked the hallway without touching the wall at every step. He stopped at the big window, placed his palm on the glass this time, not confusing warmth and light. "Light," he said, then turned back. In his eyes, a thread stretched from that brightness outside to the 2 adults waiting for him inside. Julia never touched the medication regimen, but she needed to know what the bottles contained. On Wednesday morning, While the household was busy in a meeting, she borrowed a half-used vial, slipped it into a zip bag, and carefully photographed the position of each item in the box so she could put everything back exactly as it was. She drove to the cafe across from the hospital where Sophia Carter had agreed to meet. Sophia's lab coat hung on the back of her chair, her hair neatly tied, eyes bright with the mix of fatigue and conviction of someone who believed in her work. "Let me see," Sophia said briskly. 2 days later, a message arrived. "Come now." Julia returned to the hospital. Sophia pulled her into a small office and laid out a printed analysis cyclopentolate, but not the standard short-term formulation. The concentration and additives were such that if used long-term, they could suppress light reflexes, especially in children. Sophia didn't soften it. "This isn't clerical error, it's deliberate. And the prescriber's name, Atticus Morrow. I've heard it before and not in a good way." Julia gripped the paper, her lungs hollow. Could it be a mistake, not intentional? Sophia shook her head. "There are lawsuits in several states, many settled quietly. I can't speak to motive, but his prescribing pattern repeats across children." That word "repeats" hit the desk like metal. That night, Julia placed the report before Richard. He read, top to bottom, lips pressed shut until the last line. At Morrow's name, he shot to his feet, went to the window, pressing a hand to his forehead as if to erase something etched there for years. He said the optic nerve was below standard. "He told me my son had no retinal response," Richard rasped. Julia didn't comfort. She handed him page 2, the pediatric warning section. Richard sank into a chair, nodding slowly. "We need a writer and a keeper of records. We'll lift the whole file cabinet." The next day, Richard called Dana Brooks, a journalist he had once worked with on agricultural projects. Cautious, never sensational. Dana came with a portable scanner, spent 3 hours in the study digitizing files. She asked carefully, no pressure, no premature conclusions. "We need 2 things," Dana said. 1 independent verification. 2 repeat patterns in other families. Richard nodded. Julia nodded. News leaked in whispers before spreading. The next morning, an anonymous article appeared on a tabloid site hinting that Richard had ignored recommended therapies. Another accused a maid of making up stories about light for attention. Julia skimmed, didn't answer. She put her phone away, sat on the rug with Eli, and handed him a yellow crayon. The smear campaign didn't stop him from tracing another bright line on paper. But by noon, Julia's phone buzzed with anonymous text, "Stop. This isn't your business." Another, "You'll regret it." Julia screenshotted them, sent them to Richard and Dana. Richard said, "We log it." No reply. Dana traced the IPs, hit a private server cloaking service. "Someone's scared of this story," she said. "That means we're on the right track." Outside, voices roared. Inside, data kept building. Eli tracked slow-moving shadows. More steadily recognized circles on rough and smooth backgrounds walked the hall with fewer touches. Dr. Patel reviewed Julia's videos, adjusted the exercises, add black outlines to pale objects, move from high contrast to neutral backgrounds. By week 3, insert breaks to avoid neural fatigue. Friday evening, Richard laid an envelope before Julia I filed with the district attorney's office. The lead, Michael Grant, said Morrow's name isn't unfamiliar. His gaze was no longer clouded by guilt, but sharpened by purpose. "Julia, we keep going." Julia nodded. No words needed, the nod was enough weight. The next morning, 2 other families arrived at the mansion, arms full of files and trembling voices, prescriptions, dosing logs, vague results, years worn down at their children's bedsides. In the living room between Dana's scanner and Ella's teapot, they pieced together lives. Each story fit another shard into the mosaic, a recurring prescription, a long shadow. That afternoon, Richard's phone rang. The prosecutor's office had issued subpoenas for records from clinics linked to Morrow. The state medical board was now involved. "It will take time," Michael Grant said, "but that doesn't mean standing still." Richard lowered the phone, rested his forehead against the cabinet for a second. When he lifted it, Julia saw a changed man less burdened by the past, heavier with the present. That night, Eli taped a new drawing to the fridge, yellow lines woven together like a ladder to a window. He pointed to it, hesitant. "Light, happy." Julia smiled, hand on his shoulder. No one in the room spoke of the smear pieces, the threats, or the name Morrow. They stood before a child's page. Outside, the storm gathered. Inside, the light was growing millimeter by millimeter. In the days after the filing with the district attorney, the Wakefield phone was no longer silent. Michael Grant called Richard on a steady rhythm. Subpoenas had gone out to clinics that once partnered with Atticus Morrow, to dispensing pharmacies, and to 2 pharmaceutical companies named on rebate invoices. In the study, Dana Brooks had her portable scanner running, arranging files into a timeline: newborn diagnosis, prescription, dosing schedule, no improvement notes, refill bills. Julia helped with her signature, care marking overlaps between her records of light responses and the times the drops were given. By Wednesday noon, Michael called. "We found a private contract between Morrow and a middleman tied to a pharma lab. Clause access to phase trial compound in exchange for off-clinic monitoring." He exhaled. The wording is clever, but the smell is clear. Emails seized showed product codes matching what Sophia Carter had flagged in her report. Money flowed through shell accounts. Trips and conference fees looked like payouts. Meanwhile, the smear campaign escalated. An anonymous account posted a telephoto shot of the Wakefield garden captioned, "Billionaire stages a miracle," to distract from shady business. The comments below stank of bots. Richard installed extra cameras on the fence and shifted Eli's light practice sessions to unpredictable times. Julia got more texts. Stay out of grown-ups' business Maid this time, with a grainy photo of her back in the hospital parking lot when she'd met Sophia. She saved even the EXIF data. That evening, Dana presented her first draft. No accusations, no verdicts, just a chain of verified facts. Richard read line by line, nodded publish when the DA gives the green light. Julia, new to journalism, asked, "What if they attack my skin color?" Dana looked up. When truth is thick enough, what they throw just falls. A short line, but Julia held it like a shield. While the outside world tightened the noose inside the house, the rhythm of learning held morning curtain at 1/3 contrast, card swaying ball. Afternoon yellow-blue objects. Evening flashlight spot filtered with paper. Eli tracked shadows with more stability. Recognized circles even with thinner outlines, spoke new words, car, dad. One night, he nudged Richard, whispering, "Dad, look," pointing at a yellow streak he'd just drawn. Richard bent low for the first time, not correcting posture or saying, "Sit up straight." He was learning to follow instead of pull. A week later, Michael reported Morrow was no longer at his last address. DMV records in the next state listed a vehicle under the name George Atkins. The blurred photo showed the same jawline. Federal marshals coordinated an arrest at a short-term rental near the bus depot, a doctor in false identity, a kitchen table with appointments for 2 patients listed only by mothers' names, no clinic attached. When the news reached them, Richard was in the living room, Julia beside Eli as he connected yellow lines into his first recognizable circle. Richard froze, hand gripping the chair back, no victory shout, only whispered, "It's time." The next day, Michael invited Richard and Julia to the DA's office to prep testimony. A small conference room, a whiteboard full of bullet points. "We'll ask closely about your light testing," Michael told Julia. They'll try to paint you as superstitious or attention-seeking. Stay in the method 1 variable time repetition. Julia nodded. He turned to Richard. You'll be asked why you trusted Morrow so long. Don't defend. Just tell it. Richard said I was blind in another way. That night, Dana published the article, A History of Silence, the Eli Wakefield file, and the trajectory of prolonged prescriptions. No clickbait, no slander. The conclusion stated plainly, the DA has initiated an investigation. All parties are invited to respond. Within 24 hours, parents with similar dead ends shared it. Dana's anonymous inbox exploded with files, identical prescriptions, vague notes, a repeating fear in every line. Within the same 24 hours, the Wakefields welcomed 2 more families into the living room. A shy girl traced the circle on Julia's wall card the way Eli once had. Her mother met Julia's eyes, and nothing more was needed. Ella brewed more tea. Tom delayed his yard work to quiet the noise. The mansion, once a warehouse of silence, was now a station where people stayed long enough to be heard. One afternoon, Richard took Eli to an empty park. Sun-stretched thin trees cast straight shadows. Eli stood under a maple eyes, following a drifting leaf. Wind, he said. And light. Richard answered. No photos were taken. No proof was needed to hold the moment 2 people were enough. A week later, the indictment was announced unlawful use of experimental compounds, inappropriate, prescribing falsified documentation, and multiple related charges. One pharmaceutical company denied involvement, but the DA's emails and wire transfers told another story. A preliminary hearing was set for 6 weeks. Michael said, "We'll move to protect the children's identities." Eli won't enter the courtroom. Richard looked to Julia. She nodded. Eli doesn't need to see that to see the world. That weekend night, Eli pinned his newest drawing to the fridge, a closed circle, rough but whole. He patted the paper, grinning son. Julia laid her hand on his hair, whispering, "Yes, and this morning you drew it." The county courthouse gleamed. The gallery wasn't packed, but the press benches were full. Atticus Morrow wore a dark suit, stiff collar, face cold. At the defense table sat a high-profile attorney, low-voice questions honed like razors. On the prosecution side, Michael Grant arranged files with color tabs, contracts, emails, lab reports, expert testimony, parents' accounts. The session opened with procedural sparring. The defense moved to exclude the lab report claiming chain of custody unclear. Michael produced the transfer log from Julia to Sophia, from lab to DA, along with Julia's photos of the wooden box and each vial's placement. The judge admitted it. First witness, Sophia Carter. She explained cyclopentolate, its concentration mixture, its effect on light reflex, and why long-term use in children was unsafe. The defense pressed, "Can you be certain this vial wasn't altered?" Sophia pointed to the embossed serial number and its match with product codes from Morrow's emails identical. Her voice was steady enough to blunt the blade. Second witness, Dr. Patel. He described Eli's vision, partial functional sight sensitivity to light-dark change capacity for improvement with proper stimulation. Michael asked, "Is the improvement after stopping the drops likely related?" Patel chose carefully. "I say strong correlation. Causation is for the board to decide." The defense seized on correlation, trying to stretch it to coincidence. Patel smiled. Coincidence doesn't repeat under protocol. Then Julia Bennett took the stand. She stood straight, hands loosely clasped. Michael asked short, clear questions: what she did, why one variable, how she logged each test, when the light came on, when curtains moved, how Eli responded. Julia didn't tell a moving story. She recited a chain of experiments. The defense turned personal. "You're a maid, not an expert. You wanted fame, didn't you?" Julia met his gaze. I wanted the truth so I could care for a child. You imposed your wishes on him. I waited and wrote down what repeated. The defense hinted at her race with a veiled remark about socioeconomic context influencing motives. Julia's face didn't change. My motive was Eli's safety. Safety has no color. The courtroom rippled. By late morning, Richard Wakefield testified. I believed Morrow because I wanted certainty. I was tired and afraid. I stopped asking. That was my failure. Michael didn't embellish. The defense tried to twist guilt into personal vendetta. Richard shook his head. I do have a grudge against my own silence. In the afternoon, the prosecution presented a string of emails. Morrow, writing to a pharma coordinator about target populations, high compliance, low response thresholds. Wire transfers appeared on the screen labeled Conference Fees Consulting. Dana Brooks confirmed the sources and her verification steps. The defense tried to frame her article as media bias. Dana calmly recited each check, each newsroom ethic. The defense called its own expert claiming congenital defect explained everything. Michael asked, do you have before-after data for stopping the drops? No. Do you have cases with this same formulation? No, Michael turned to the jury. In science, no is data 2 the data of wholes. Day 2, 2 other parents testified. No grand homes, no legal teams, only receipts and years of exhaustion. The prescriptions were chillingly identical. When the second mother said I begged once to stop the drops just to see, but the doctor scolded me, reporters' pens froze for a moment. Day 3. The prosecution submitted Eli's drawings, first yellow streaks, then a closed circle, then one with 2 circles like twin suns. Michael didn't call it art as evidence. He marked it timeline aligned with drop cessation and stimulus protocol. Defense objected to emotionalizing. Judge allowed it for context. Closing the defense spoke smoothly. No certainty, no crime. Michael rose, voice calm. Absolute certainty isn't the standard of life or justice. Clarity is. Here we have inappropriate medication, tainted money, repeated prescriptions across children, repeated responses under protocol after stopping the drug and a cover-up campaign. That is clear enough. The jury retired. The room held its breath low. Julia clasped her work-worn hands under the table. Richard fixed his eyes on an invisible point looking through the past. When the jury returned, the judge unfolded the slip. On the charge of unlawful use of experimental compounds on children, guilty. On the charge of falsifying records, guilty. On the charge of harm from inappropriate prescribing, guilty. The room didn't erupt. It settled like a string finally in tune. Morrow never turned to anyone. His lawyer flipped to the appeals calendar. The pharmaceutical firm named in emails issued a denial, but regulators that same week fined and suspended several trial licenses. Sentencing date was set. Michael turned to Richard and Julia. No victory handshake only. Thank you for staying long enough. Outside, Dana asked, do you want to speak to the press? Richard shook his head. Julia, too. They walked straight to the car, rode in silence. At the turnoff home, Richard finally said, tonight we don't talk about court. Julia, tonight we draw. In the kitchen, Ella had laid out heavier paper, fresh crayons. Eli ran barefoot to the table, chose yellow then blue, set them side by side. Sky and sun, he said. Richard sat next to him. Julia across. No one told him what to draw. He drew a yellow circle around a blue one, then 2 small lines linking them. Dad, you, me. Eli explained each word like a stone set gently in their palms. On the porch, wind stirred the glass curtains. Inside, the scratch of crayon on paper was the loudest sound. No clapping, no speeches. The court had spoken its part. The rest, learning to see and be seen, belonged to 3 people around a white page. The sentencing took place on a dry morning, the sky a sharp, unforgiving blue. Atticus Morrow stood rigid, face set, like stone. The judge read out the penalties for each charge: prison time for unlawful use of experimental compounds on children, prison and fines for falsifying records, a permanent ban on practicing medicine. At the same time, the state medical board announced tighter pediatric trial regulations requiring transparent disclosure of all funding and payments. Several pharmaceutical companies named in the emails were fined and had portions of their licenses suspended. Morrow never looked back. When the gavel struck, the sound wasn't loud, but the echo carried across years of silence. Outside the courthouse, Richard gave no statement. Julia didn't either. They walked straight to the car. Inside, the quiet felt like a room given back its air. "Tonight we don't talk about court." Richard set eyes on the road toward the lake. Julia nodded. "Tonight we draw." In the kitchen, lights glowed. Ella had laid out thick paper and a fresh box of crayons. Eli ran barefoot, stopped at the table. He chose yellow, then blue, setting the colors side by side. "Sky and sun," he said, slowly. Richard sat next to him, Julia across. No one told him what to draw. Eli traced a yellow circle around a blue one, then 2 short lines connecting them. "Dad, you, me," he explained, each word falling light as a pebble into still water. The weeks that followed were about building. Richard cut back his schedule, handing off part of the business. He hired an interior architect to turn a spare room into a small studio, walls painted soft gray to make colors pop high, sea eye lights, shelves at Eli's reach, low chairs, rounded corner tables. Dr. Patel sent a detailed intervention plan: mornings with curtains, 1/3 open, slow tracking exercises with small-range, high-contrast shape cards. Afternoons with color pairs, yellow-blue, red-green, gradually shifting to neutral backgrounds. Evenings with half-covered flashlight beams, stopping immediately at any excessive brow tension. School came sooner than they expected. The Oak Ridge Elementary principal's office was bright. On the desk lay an IEP built with the support team and Dr. Patel. Ms. Alvarez, the homeroom teacher, spoke warmly. "We'll go slow and clear. Eli can sit where the light is stable, use bold black and white boards, and take short breaks between activities." Julia took notes. Richard's shoulders tensed, then eased as he saw the boxes checked. The first school day was a forest of noise chairs scraping pencils, tapping chalk, squeaking on the board. Eli stood in the doorway, teddy bear clutched. Julia knelt to his level, whispering, "If it feels too loud, touch my hand." Eli touched, then he stepped inside. His desk mate, Noah Hairmessy, handed him a yellow circle sticker. "This is the sun. You keep it." Eli smiled. The day wasn't smooth. There were startled pauses at flashy posters, but when drawing time came, and Miss Alvarez offered crayons, Eli picked yellow. She didn't ask why. She slid gray paper in front of him. A yellow line appeared. Noah nudged his shoulder. "Looks good." At home, the light schedule was marked with round stickers, each one for a completed session. Mrs. Harper, once distant, now counted drawing rhythms with Eli 3 circles. He nodded. Tom Briggs shifted mowing hours so the machine wouldn't cut through afternoon practice. Ella wrapped an empty jar in yellow paper, labeled it "Sunlight in Reserve," and set it by the window. On rainy days, Eli opened the lid, took a breath, laughed, still light. One evening, the postman delivered an envelope embossed with the seal of the National Children's Foundation. Richard opened it. Reading slowly, Eli had been chosen to receive the Resilient Child Medal and invited to serve as an ambassador for sensory recovery programs. The ceremony will be next month, City Convention Center, the letter said. Eli ran his finger over the golden emboss. Yellow, he said, clear and round. The night before the ceremony, Richard placed a small box on Julia's table, adoption papers. Completed. "Julia," he said, "I've thought of this for a long time. Eli needs a mother. And he's already chosen." Julia saw the blue ink seal, saw her name beside guardian and adoptive mother. For a few long seconds she couldn't speak. At last, only one word came, soft as breath. "Thank you." Ceremony day. The stage was a wide backdrop, a calm blue. The name Eli Wakefield rang out, and he walked on in a small suit with a golden pin. The host bent to place the medal around his neck. Eli touched the edge of the medal, murmured, "Cool." When applause faded, the MC smiled. "Today we have a surprise. Every story of a resilient child has a resilient adult beside them. We honor Julia Bennett, who stayed long enough, who counted the light, who trusted repetition over miracles. And congratulations. The court has confirmed Julia as Eli's adoptive mother and lifelong guardian." Julia froze, as if a breeze had pushed her. Eli turned hand, finding hers squeezing. Together, they stepped forward. The hall rose to its feet. No speeches. Just a boy and a mother standing side by side beneath warm golden lights, and a father below, eyes glistening as if he'd finally seen himself reflected in clear water. That night at home, Eli hung his medal beside the closed circle drawing. He whispered to Julia, small but loud enough for the room, "Mom." Julia closed her eyes for a beat, hand resting on his back. Across the room, Richard turned away to swallow a sob, then turned back with a quiet smile. The house that had once been a warehouse of silence now beat with a new rhythm, a rhythm with golden notes. Years passed, and Eli grew in his own steady, singular way. He didn't become a normal child in the rigid sense of the word. He became Eli, the one who could read light and hear color. In high school, he chose the art club over sports. His easel stood before a window, afternoon light pouring through golden and warm like honey. Miss Alvarez was now an old friend, but her advice about contrast and breaks between sessions remained his ritual. The studio in the mansion was upgraded, adjustable spotlights, a large easel, shelves of acrylics and oils. Julia no longer logged every minute as she once had. She mixed paints, rinsed brushes, and sat quietly in the corner reading or simply watching Eli paint. Richard spent many afternoons on the windowsill reading the paper, his new habit being present without commanding. At 17, an email arrived from River City School of Art, an invitation to their pre-college program for promising students. The interview took place in a white room. Two instructors asked many questions about ideas, few about medical history. Why yellow? Because it's warm and real. It feels like someone is there. The panel nodded. A month later, Eli received an acceptance letter and a partial scholarship. Richard helped him rent a small apartment near the school. Julia taped a slim yellow strip to the kitchen shelf, joking it was a runway for light to land. Eli's painting shifted from simple yellow strokes. He added deep blues, like dusk reds, like the dress in the old photograph, greens, like young maple shadows. He began a series called First Light Imperfect Circles, lines connecting yellow and blue fragments like windows opening. One canvas was just a thin yellow streak cutting through a block of darkness. Someone said it was too dark. Eli smiled. Darkness shows you where the light is. Dana Brooks, now an editor, visited his studio, proposing a small exhibition at the Maple Street Gallery. Sophia Carter and Dr. Patel sent flowers ahead of opening night, a bouquet of yellow gerberas with a card, "Remember to count your breaths." Michael Grant came late from a trial, still slipping quietly into the back as always. Opening night, the gallery was fuller than expected. People gathered before a closed circle, a rough yellow ring, thick and thin, sealed by a join that didn't hide itself. Children pointed and whispered, "Son." Adults fumbled for words to name their emotion. Julia stood in a corner, simple black dress, yellow pin on her chest. Richard, beside her jacket, fastened eyes no longer clouded. At 7, the gallery manager invited Eli to speak. He stepped to the mic, fingers rubbing the edge of his resilient child medal. He always carried it like a lucky stone. The room hushed. People often ask when I first saw light. Eli said, slow, clear each word, holding on to the next. They want me to say it was the flashlight or the sun on the glass or the first yellow streak on paper. He paused, eyes drifting past the crowd, finding one fixed point. Julia, warm-eyed hands gently clasped. But my first light, Eli continued, didn't come through my eyes. It came from her heart. He pointed toward Julia. The gallery held still for a long beat, then applause rose, not roaring, but full like a bowl filled to the brim. Julia touched the medal at her chest, not to display it, but to remind herself of the day she stood before a stack of towels and a wooden box, trembling from the smell of chemicals on her fingertips. Richard laid a hand on her shoulder light, steady the touch of a man who had learned to carry the weight of his heart in pieces that could be borne together. After the speech, people wandered among the canvases, whispering. A young boy in a knit cap, clutching his mother's coat, stopped before Runway Mom. "Why does the yellow go straight?" She smiled. "Because it knows the way." Eli overheard, lowered his head, smiling. Late at night, the gallery. Empty staff peeling off sold stickers. Eli sat on the floor back against the wall, breathing the way Julia had once taught 4 counts in 4 out. Julia sat beside him, Richard on the other side. No one spoke of the past. The courts had already spoken. No one spoke of the future. The calendar would write itself in mornings with 1/3 curtains, afternoons of yellow and blue, evenings of filtered light. Mom Eli said this time, not a whisper, not fractured. "I want to paint a bridge between these 2 pieces." Julia nodded. "Tomorrow we will." Richard smiled. "I'll mix the colors." The 3 stood. Outside, Maple Street was lined with warm yellow lamplight on wet pavement. Inside, the first light kept moving forward 1 step at a time, not from a bulb or a window, but from someone who had stayed long enough to count it with a boy. From a mansion of silence to the first light gallery, Eli's journey, as the boy once called blind from birth, reminds us that sometimes a single attentive heart like Julia's can reignite a life. Justice had spoken, but more importantly, family was reborn. Richard learned presence. Julia became a mother, and Eli drew his own son. Question for you. Which moment of this story touched you most, and what first light do you want to bring to someone in your life? If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe with the bell on so you don't miss the next episode.